Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that brings you mind-expansive conversations into the heart of what matters most. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is Dor Konforty, a neuroscientist, entrepreneur, investor, and awakening teacher dedicated to distilling the first principles of the Dharma and bringing them to every aspect of human life. He spent most of his 20s conducting interdisciplinary brain research in academic settings, and his 30s as an entrepreneur and CEO in the decentralization space, applying his neuroscience background to envision a more collaborative, non-zero-sum human networks. In parallel, he has devoted thousands of hours to meditation practice, as well as growth and relational modalities, training closely with pragmatic Dharma teachers such as Culadasa, Daniel Ingram, and Delson Armstrong, and personal development coaches like Joe Hudson and Kim Barta. He's the founder of the Awakening Fund, a venture that invests in technologies aimed at making meditation unnecessary. Dor is also the author of the Heart Illuminated, a spiritual successor to Culadasa's The Mind Illuminated. Drawing on over 15 years of multidisciplinary experience, the book lays out a clear and systematic path towards awakening through a completely modern lens. In this episode, we speak about Dor's book, The Heart Illuminated, his time studying with Culadasa, as well as his collaborations with pragmatic Dharma practitioners Daniel Ingram and Delson Armstrong, his investment in meditation tech, navigating controversy with spiritual teachers, and so much more. Enjoy. Dor Konforty, welcome to the show. Yeah, thanks a lot for coming on. I just want to set a little bit of context before we dive in. I think I first came across your name through a Sangha we're both a part of. And then I think I saw your name just pop up on my Facebook and ended up reading a post you wrote about politics, and it really resonated with me, which led me to add you as a friend. And not long after, someone in the Sangha mentioned that you had just released a book. Mm-hmm. So I ended up clicking on that and was struck by the depth of your understanding of meditation, as well as your ability to communicate practice in a way that's both technically precise and highly accessible. And like you, I've been deeply influenced by the Pragmatic Dharma movement, and The Mind Illuminated was a foundational text for me early on in my journey. So it's been really cool to see your work as an evolution of that stream. And I've thoroughly enjoyed engaging with your book, your meditation logs, and your conversations on YouTube. And I'm excited to dive deeper into your perspectives today. Perhaps you could start by sharing a bit about your background, how you got into meditation, and what inspired you to write The Heart Illuminated.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for all of your kind words. Makes me feel very welcome and appreciated. Most people do not find me through my political posts. And, it's always a bit of a tension that I have if that's what I want to put out there. When generally speaking, what I care more about putting out opinions is to have the message of finding connection below the level of opinion. So it's always creates some tension for me. But I'm glad to see that it brings on interesting people into my life.
For sure.
So in terms of background, I would say, the story that I always tell was exposed to various forms of meditation since I was 12 and started dabbling when I was 14. But I did not even come across Buddhism proper until I was 25. I did not know there was Buddhist meditation. I did not know that Buddhist philosophy was operationalizable. And the time when I was really deeply enamored with that as a way of thinking was when I was 22 and read Gödel Escher Bach, where he makes a really good rational point for the complete insanity of anything but the Zen point of view. The way that we become trapped inside maps of reality. So it took me a few years to figure out that there's a way out of the incepted dream. And that's led me on an exploration of many different traditions and teachers all over the world. And the main one that I spent a lot of time with ended up being Culadasa of the Mind Illuminated. Spent months and months in retreat with them. And he was a neuroscientist, which is mostly what I did throughout my 20s. And in some way, when I read the book, I realized that he wrote the book that I had always wanted to. Like so many of the insights I've had on a parallel track. And so meeting him and then having a chance to have like the friction of all of our ideas and wisdoms come online and aside and alongside exploration of many other traditions, Buddhist and other, and throughout all the turnings of the wheel, all the conceptions of it, was just a really beautiful, fertile ground for developing my thinking, both on the so-called Eastern Front, classical wisdom, but then also what comes from more modern psychology, integral theory, and everything that we now know that's classified under growing up, that just did not exist at all in the times that the Eastern philosophies were cultivated. So what I'm trying to do really is to create both a very robust intellectual understanding and explanation of the whole path, stemming from first principles, and utilizing the types of mental maps and memes that are available to us in the West, and that in some way make the whole understanding of the path much simpler. Right? We have cognitive tools and capacities for abstraction and formal thinking that are way beyond what was possible hundreds and thousands of years ago. And I really want to leverage those all the way into such a deep understanding, and then also have that infuse the actual practice instructions so much so that the path is much simpler, a lot simpler than I had to piece together with myself with all sorts of books and old languages and a bit more of like a mystical hand-wavy type of thing that exists out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting kind of like reading some of your stuff, and I can definitely see why you'd be kind of drawn to Culadasa out of everybody in that book, The Mind Illuminated. And I think for me, that book was, I think reading that book was like because I was meditating for a little while before then. And then when I read that book, I was like, okay, like I didn't really understand meditation till I started reading that book. In particular, he had like the stuff that he had about like how the mind wanders. Like it was very clear, like, oh, this is what happens. Like you get like the subtle distraction, and then some of your mind kind of wanders off. The rest of your mind is there. And then slowly, if you don't notice that and you're not aware of that, then more of your attention kind of wavers, and then you're completely lost in mind wandering. And then the other thing was about subtle dullness, right? It's like how the mind kind of just gets comfortable and you get like overly relaxed and you're not bright. And then, as that happens, you get kind of closer and closer to sleep. And, at some point you could even fall asleep. So it was just really kind of interesting seeing those pieces. But maybe you could speak to kind of like what stood out for you, particularly about Culadasa's approach and the Mind Illuminated.
So, first of all, exactly what you described, this stage-based approach where you know exactly what to do depending on what your attentional skills are. It's just brilliant. It's just what the engineering-minded denizens of the internet need, right? Like so many meditations are sort of just like go sit on the cushion and maybe pay attention to this and focus on that, and something happens at some point. And this was so meticulously laid out, right? And when to move on and what the pitfalls are. And so that's one thing. But the second is I was just completely enamored by his conception of the mind model as he laid it out and continued evolving, complexifying through the book. It resonated with so much of my thinking. I actually, my partner at the time read the book. She was like, hey, he's speaking your language. Go check it out. And yeah, I was reading it. It was like mind blown. Like he took those ideas and expanded on them and presented them so beautifully, right? And it's written so well, and with the examples and the illustrations, I was just so inspired. And yeah, and then I had the great privilege of spending so many hours with him, just like drinking directly from the well, and yeah, very inspiring.
Yeah, how did that happen? Did you just end up reaching out to him, do a retreat, and then I imagine there's many people that have done retreats and sat with him, but like somehow you ended up, like, from my understanding, working really closely with him.
Yeah, actually never sat a retreat with him. I moved to the Bay Area in 2016 in search of consciousness hacking or enlightenment engineering. And 2016, even before moving here, is when I read the book. And I couldn't wait to come here and see if there's any way for me to reach out. It was not very available. But I ended up reaching out through his wife. I don't even remember exactly how, and got on a call with him, like a one-on-one, and we just hit it off very quickly, and for a period of a few years. And I also, being a CEO of my company, I would just spend about 2 weeks out of every 2 months in Arizona with him in his stronghold retreat center, working from there and just meditating as much as I could and speaking to him as much as he was available. And that's how our relationship really blossomed.
Mm. And, you mentioned that when you read The Mind Illuminated, you realized Culadasa had written the book that you wanted to read. But I'm wondering, though, if your decision to write The Heart Illuminated was based on a realization that there might have been some vital aspects from the path of awakening that were missing in The Mind Illuminated, or maybe, I guess it's in the title, like, The Mind Illuminated, The Heart Illuminated, maybe there was something more that had to do with the heart, compassion. I'm just curious kind of how you decided to do like this. I don't know if it's a revision or like an extension or a building on top of it.
There's so much to say about this. First and foremost, I'll say that I wrote my book, The Heart Illuminated, so that it's standalone. You don't have to have any knowledge of the Mind Illuminated. And what's different or new, I would say, even as it's a spiritual successor, is, first of all, Culadasa never intended to only have the Heart Illuminated. He was constantly working on follow-up books for the later stages of the path. And in many ways, a core focus of my mission in writing, and it's not yet complete, is to lay out the entire path from a completely naive person to meditation and all the way up to Buddhahood, the complete fruition of all of the teachings of this entire path, and lay it out as meticulously as Culadasa did, with clear stages and instructions on how to identify where you are, how to take the next step. And so that's one elaboration that I'm doing. Something that Culadasa never managed to do in the much shorter amount of life that he had left than he had planned, and we were all hoping for. So that's one thing. Another is, from my studies with many other teachers, many other traditions, I created a path that's very similar to the elephant path that Culadasa describes in The Mind Illuminated, that also has imbued in it other benefits beyond just shamatha, beyond just collecting the mind. In a way, the thing that I'm trying to do, even in this relatively early stages of collecting the mind, is not just concentration, so to speak, not just like grabbing the mind and pushing it, even in some sense, through focus, through effort, but actually creating a consensus of mind. It's the word that I like to use. It of course still requires some effort, some flame, some energy poured in, but then the type of configuration that's created has more to do with all of the subminds, in Culadasa speak, agreeing on how they want to be in a way that's both conducive to meditation and also to the path going forward. So that's one thing on just the first map. In some sense, you could treat the entire path as divided to 3 maps, which comes from, and this division comes from the Mahamudra tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, that I know you're very familiar with, which is ground, path, and fruition. And it's funny to say that in those maps, each also having a division to 4 yogas, 4 elements, in some sense, the elephant path is just an overview of the first yoga, the first element of the first map. And so There is a way that it's the most difficult one because it requires the most amount of effort. But without then using the mind that's been created, the Tibetans call it the serviceable mind. In Tilmai, Culadasa speaks about malleable plastic mind. Without using that for insight practices or emptiness practices, or practices that are meant to create entirely new foundational agreements of the mind of the different participants based on clarity of seeing that's only available from this level of collectedness, the path doesn't really progress. It's very, very hard to go all the way just doing those first yoga practices or just mind collectedness practices. It's sort of like trying to get to your destination with a car only driving in first gear. So a lot of what's new in the book is going all the way in such a manner. And on the intellectual side, what I'm trying to do is describe the entire path from first principles and showing how they apply or they are mirrored in many of the other complex systems that we know from our day-to-day life, especially if we're experts in physics or engineering or socioeconomics or so many of the other systems of our lives that we can examine from a perspective of development, of complexification, and then using those insights, using those analogies to directly point to the nature of the mind, to the way that the mind, and I really like taking a developmental perspective for the evolution of the mind towards awakening, towards enlightenment, and give people an inescapable insight into not only how the path conduces, how it progresses, but also the way that it's incredibly beneficial, incredibly useful for our day-to-day lives. There's somewhat of a revolution happening right now in this regard, but for the most part, there's still a way that people treat spirituality and meditation as a part of it as more of like a hobby or a way to explore mystical phenomena. A lot of the claim that I'm making is that through this evolution of the configuration of the mind, we can create a better life for ourselves as we want it to be. There's a lot of talk about letting go of the self, and in the West there's then an appeal to not being selfish. It's a way that's a little marred by more of the Judeo-Christian morality and a sense of maybe there's like an original sin that we sort of have to make up for, and that's sort of synonymous with suffering. But those concepts are not aligned. There's some truth in the combination of them, but I think it's really important to tease them out and get to the point where people can see that meditation doesn't make them pious in some way. It's not about renunciating. It's not about letting go of the world or your passions, so to speak. It's about seeing more clearly and then having the power of choice. So to circle back to your originating question about the heart versus the mind illuminated, a lot of the emphasis is both on explaining what this whole heart thing is, how an open heart comes about, what it means for the entire configuration of the body and mind, not just the mind, and then the way that the open heart is a reflection of the changes of the internal configurations, such that kindness, compassion, gratitude, friendliness, the Brahma-viharas, as we call them, arise naturally without requiring effort. And it's both a type of self-compassion or a way to treat ourselves or all of our parts with these types of attitudes and everything around us. And so when the heart is illuminated, when we have both an understanding of what it means to enact those configurations internally and externally, and we have them arise naturally, we start creating structures in the world, networks of collaboration, ways of treating our environments, our relationships, our societies, in ways that reflect the Dharma. And that's a lot of the mission that I'm on: how to create a heart-centered society composed of heart-centered humans, and even all the way into a place where I imagine, once this is the foundation of our society, once these are the principles that we operate on, people don't have to meditate anymore. It just becomes so baked into our operating system, into our assumptions, that we sort of get the benefits of meditation for free.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like maybe like one of the most interesting and maybe also like a controversial idea, that, get to a point where we don't have to meditate. And I want to definitely circle back to that, because I think it's really interesting. And maybe that's also related to the question of technology and what that role can play in that. But yeah, there was a lot of other threads and things you were mentioning before that I want to touch on. And I think one thread that's pretty interesting is, well, the fact that your book is not complete. So you kind of uploaded this book online, so it's not available in physical copy. It's all online on your website. And yeah, there's some sections that are still not done. And yeah, I guess it's also interesting because it seems like the way you've been writing this book is like getting a lot of feedback from other practitioners, and that's really interesting to me, is like this way of writing it. And maybe I'm wondering, like, your decision to release it before it's done, maybe there's something in that, like, okay, I have a good chunk here, I have some good stuff that could be valuable and it can help people, and at the same time maybe I can get even more feedback now and maybe refine things. I'm just kind of curious, like what your process has been of writing this, and like what you're thinking going forward.
Yeah, so I really like iterative processes. It's always been my thing. Whether I was a follower or a leader, regardless of what I'd done, like I wanted to put something out there and iterate. It's very startup CEO type thinking also, put an MVP out there and see what's up. And the version that I have out there is certainly not just a beta or anything. It's very complete. It's also much more than like one normal book length at this point. I did write it over the years with a lot of input from, at the beginning, friends, and then people who started becoming my students. And I wanted to make sure, because a lot of the words that I'm using, a lot of the conceptions that I'm putting forward, both in the intellectual part of the book and the practice book, are very novel, even experimental. In the book, I'm inviting people to go into an experiment in meditation, an experiment in being humans. And before putting it out to the public, I did indeed want to have something that's more of an ongoing testing with the growing community that I had. And at some point, I could have continued writing for many more years to come, but people were telling me, just put it out there. This is already so useful. It's been so instrumental in my path. I've learned so much. Every time I read, I learn something new. It's like, okay, why not? You could put it out there. Let a greater sphere of participants engage, get even more feedback if that comes through. I think people are a little more hesitant to provide feedback when it's like official on the website. And soon we will also have a printed version. I have someone working on that because people are asking. But yeah, I still want to get responses from people, both to get a sense of how it's landing and see maybe I can learn something, maybe I can improve certain things, but also to see how to prioritize what I want to write next, because there's so much that I want to explore. There's like a whole giant network of ideas that are still only mostly exist here, and so I'm selective in what I'm what I'm putting out, partly based on what feels like is drawn from the universe, from the participants in this community.
I'm just kind of grateful that you put it out, because we were already able to have some of these conversations. But I think the other thing is the fact that insights can deepen and change. So maybe something that you held or saw in a certain way 5 years ago is different now. And maybe by the time, you finish editing this and putting it out again, more things will change. And yeah, it's the fact that we can kind of adapt and change our perspectives. And when you print the book, it's like, even with any book, it's like it's printed and it's kind of like it's off. And then who knows, like a week later, you might have a new realization. You're like, oh yeah, now I need to go back and So, there was other things that were kind of standing out in what you were saying. And, I think the thing that was really interesting to me from Chuldasa's book was this notion of subminds. And I want to say I was already familiar with parts work when I heard of subminds. I'm not exactly sure which I heard first, but I just remember hearing that and having this idea of parts, and then also read this book. I imagine that you might be familiar with this book as well, called The Society of Mind by Marvin Minsky. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but yeah, but it's interesting because there he also talks about agents and like, also these aspects of the mind that function in a hierarchical nature. And for those who don't know, Marvin Minsky was like the godfather of like artificial intelligence. Mentioning this idea that from Marvin Minsky as well, from the Society of Mind of Agents, and like just connecting all of those, like the subminds, parts, agents. There was also another book called Why Everybody Else is a Hypocrite or something like that. And it talked about the modular brain and how the brain has different modules and how a particular module could be turned on at one time and then a different one turns on at another time. And that's why we kind of have like these hypocritical beliefs. So kind of just seeing all these threads, it was just like something about it. Like, oh yeah, there seems to be something really true about this idea of subminds, parts, modules. And then, I think in your book, you refer to them as coordinators. So like you build on that idea as well.
Yeah. So I use many terms. I still use subminds from time to time, and I use coordinators when it has more to do with agents of collaboration and how they come together to form networks of activity. And later in the book, I also use the term predictors, because from the perspective of information theory and then the way that we predict reality into existence. And yeah, many different explorations of how the different aspects of mind come together. And then ultimately, what I like to point to is both how those parts are generated or originate from trauma, from the type of thing that we learn to release and unhook from on this path, and the way that ultimately we can create a configuration of mind where there are no more parts. In some sense, we learn to create such internal coherence in a space of mind where our needs are answered in a way where parts don't feel like they have to fight about it. They don't have to be a champion of the particular need or particular thing that's missing in our lives. And then there's just this type of coherence that in my mind also is what ultimately allows someone to not have to meditate anymore. The closer we get to a configuration that's internally coherent in this way and based on the Brahma Viharas, based on network configurations that are non-zero sum, the less our different parts want to first, what's the word I'm looking for? Like make themselves distinct or individuate. And even more so, the less they want to polarize from other parts. And of course, that's the same thing that allows us to be, let's say, much more loving and in much greater flow with other people in our lives. Because the same internal polarizations, I'm sure many people listening to your podcast are aware of this, but the internal polarizations are then projected out and create external polarizations, and then this thing just spirals out into the world, and there's sort of a skewedness in how we make our lives and the systems of our lives, with the origin in the karma that's stored in the unconscious body mind. So a lot of this work is really useful from this perspective, or being able to entertain this perspective. But the way that the polarizations, internal and external, that cause the most suffering, are always rooted in and are traceable to some type of signal, something that we've decided is unpleasant or painful. And I use the decided loosely. Of course, it happens at a time where we don't have the capacity to allow this energy or the signal to move through us and fully contain it, fully give it the service that it otherwise would need in a space of awareness. So this entire path is just slowly peeling off the layers of identities, parts, strategies, agendas, limiting beliefs, and getting to the core thing that's just wanting to be held, wanting to be integrated in its unique quality, whatever message that it has in there.
Yeah, there was a quote I had from your book that I think is relevant here. And it's the more the forms composing our minds come to terms with the view of their non-separateness, the more they simply let go of strategies which harm or destructively compete with other forms. So I really like that quote. I guess I'm also thinking about how you see this aspect of awakening and healing coming together, because there's something of like sitting, right, and then watching certain aspects of your mind being there, right? Certain parts, certain subminds that are there wanting different things and just allowing them to be there. But there's something different about like engaging with them and working with them like we do in parts work. So it seems like there's like maybe different, but parallel processes there that, that we do maybe in therapeutic work. And then when you're sitting and trying to touch into awareness and kind of what you say, kind of like the more fundamental basis of operation, and actually just like engaging and being in relationship with parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're touching on a very important point that also, I think, distinguishes my work from many of the other meditation paths. And that's, it's the way that most meditation in the West, at least, from my perspective, I may be wrong, but from what I see, is walking the emptiness only path, meaning there's a desire to release and empty out the mind. And we can talk about that. That's a big exploration in my book, getting to the place where mental constructs are not reified. And we get closer and closer into what the Theravadins or the Pali Sutras would call seeing things as they are. Yata Bhuta Jnana Dasana. And of course, we never see things as they are. It's always filtered by the senses. Then there's a way that each sensory bit has, as it's constructed in the mind, more and more envelopes, more and more information or meta information that gets packed along with it. Sort of like the TCP/IP model, I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with, where you have the bit of information going through the network, and then there's information added to which network address, and then which protocol, and then which application, and then what it wants to do in the particular application, right? So there's more than just the bit, there's the whole meaning, this whole, what does it mean that I've received this information, that we lose the capacity to distinguish from the fundamental consciousness, from the actual contacts of the senses coming through. So the emptiness path, and that's more I'm just going to let things come and not engage with them, is what slowly allows the unpacking or the enveloping of the more fundamental streams of information and perception. The path of fullness, which is more around relationships and creating more sophisticated, more Dharma-aligned structures, is this path of fullness. Is how do we, from the empty bits that we have now freed up, construct something beautiful, construct mental constructs that reflect how we want to be, how the complete society of mind, more and more of the participants of mind, and then of course also more of the participants of the greater mind, not just the personal mind, want to be, so that they have a good life, so that they have the types of dances that they want to have, types of experiences that they want to have. And in my mind, if you only go the emptiness path, which again is an emphasis and particularly of the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, the path that leads towards being an Arhat, or what's called fourth path sometimes, it allows you freedom from verification. And without verification, there's no attachment, there's no grasping. There's no thing that in itself is reified. There's something standing separate from the world that then thinks other arising phenomena is reified or is self-existent, and then tries to do something to it. And that's the whole process of clenching. We can talk about how that mechanism comes to be, but putting that aside, the thing that I'm interested in is more of a spiral of progression, so that as we empty out, we also leverage the new bits into a way of being that is, one, more aligned with the Dharma, more aligned with the continued going towards emptiness, release of karma, being able to be in contact with something closer to fundamental consciousness, right? To the reality that's there before I have an opinion about it. And also to create types of structures, even regardless of what we consider to be the Dharma, that make for a more pleasant life, make for a life that's also more stable, more smooth, more sustainable in terms of our capacity to create beneficial conditions for our practice, both individually and in communities. And so there's this spiraling between emptying out and the fullness. And in the book, I also talk about cleaning up, which is more of the letting go of older perspectives, more immature perspectives that are sometimes stuck in pain or unprocessed emotions, suppressed emotions, and showing up, which is how to then leverage all of the skills that we're creating in this practice into being in the world in a way that both collects all of us, which is a very useful aspect of the practice. And another reason why eventually we can stop meditating. We just become so aligned on how we want to show up in the world that everything is an opportunity to bring ourselves online and see what frictions may still exist. And then ultimately, through the spiraling, through all of those elements, there is what in my mind might be the crown jewel of this whole path. And it aligns with the conception of enlightenment in Tibetan Buddhism, which is a deep and pervasive ongoing alignment with all that there is, with what sometimes is called Mahamudra, or the Hindus, Tantric Hindus would call Paravak, the Greek would call Logos, many different words for the same fundamental nature of the universe, that the more we stop spinning inside our own virtual worlds, inside our own constructs that we spin in place, continually regurgitating and perceiving and operating from those incepted realities, which is what we call samsara, and more start being fed by more pure or less constructed information coming in from all that is. And so again, just to put it all together, I believe that going not just in a linear way towards just emptiness or even anything else, just growing up, just having this spiral through all of the elements, making sure that every part of our lives is touched by our practice, is beneficial both for our capacity to continue practicing and for the greater containers of our lives, so that we create something that benefits all of us versus being monks in a cave. Ultimately, I think it's a faster path. You might get short-term, faster benefits if you just do the one thing. If you go through the spiral, ultimately you're going to get to this end of being enlightened, according to the Tibetan conception, quicker.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the fullness kind of reminds me of what Rob Orbea called soul making, this idea of skillfully playing with identity, and the spiral reminds me of a developmental lens, kind of going through all aspects of our lives and integrating all those things. But then something else that stands out to me, and I'm curious your opinion on this, because you did mention that it seems like the way you're holding your view of awakening is that it is about creating a better life. And, sometimes I've heard this from kind of many people, that awakening is not about improving your life. It's not about making things better. I've heard people say that you can't want this you know? So I'm wondering how you hold, and maybe this is related to like only walking the emptiness path. And like, if you're only walking the emptiness path, then none of these other aspects come into play. But if we start integrating and looking at how these things come together, then it is about, it's not just, it is about creating more generative outcomes. It is about making things better in the world. But like, maybe there is this view of awakening where it's like, it's just about kind of dropping all sense of meaning or any story or any sense of self. And yeah.
So I would say in my mind, there's truth to all of those statements, all of those perspectives. Generally speaking, what I like and also very much encourage in the book is to try to avoid latching onto ultimate ideas and perspectives. Like ultimately, there is no self. Ultimately, you can't want this, but rather see perspectives that can either aid you on your path, depending on where you're at, or not. And then you can use those perspectives as tools rather than destinations. You can use them as pointers for practice rather than ontologies. And so certainly there's the truth to you can't want this. For example, normally when we think want, we speak about a type of want that comes from a part that is originating from what I would call a lower basis of operation. And so the assumptions fueling that want do not take into account the larger considerations of the system. And from that perspective, the thing that we're going towards, both awakening and enlightenment, we can also talk about the distinction, are configurations where if you have a part that's attached to a particular thing that it wants, that's going to be in the way of the systemic configuration that puts you in contact with fundamental consciousness. So in this sense, you can't want. But in any moment of existence, there is a desire fueling you. There is a current of life that moves through you, without which there would be no energy for anything that you do. And in my mind, as we go on the emptiness path, or generally the path, it helps to become deeply attuned to this life force. Sometimes in the more tantric realms, we speak about eros, the basic life force that arises from the recognition of ourselves as sexual beings, because so much of what we are is an attempt to find a mate and procreate, right? And proliferate our genes. And if we ignore that energy, we're just making our lives much harder. If we can ride the eros, and it doesn't necessarily have to be towards a sexual partner. If we ride this eros, this creative force, to create the me that I want to be, to create the structures in the world that I'm passionate about, to create relationships and societies that I think will serve better both the dharmic exploration and the things that I'm passionate about, while holding the most sophisticated view available to me, a dharmic view, a liberating view, a more sophisticated configuration of mind. Those passions moving through me and going into the world allow me another touch point with this evolutionary process. So again, rather than having to go on the cushion and sort of leave the world out, and of course there's value in that. I highly recommend doing that as well. Our entire world becomes grist for the mill. Everything that we do can support the path, can support evolution. And it's, as you say, when we think about evolution, there's of course a way that evolution does itself. But evolution best does itself when we know what we want and direct ourselves to it consciously. And that's an aspect of the path that's really greatly missing from many of the conceptions of practice. And you mentioned soul making. That's one that's really on point in this regard. And that I really want to see more of us speaking of as an integral part of this journey of conscious development.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things you're pointing at with that too, with the aspect of eros and desire, and is the fact that we're participants in reality. Like, it's like we don't have ultimate control. Things are unfolding and there's so much that's happening that's beyond our control. but then we have this creative aspect to kind of infuse something that's unique to each being and each personality, and kind of like play our own part in creating this masterpiece, and like adding to this canvas. Speaking about Eros, also, it started reminding me of, I was listening to your talks with Delson. You were talking about sex is the quickest path to enlightenment. That was a funny one, but speaking about Delson, and there's another practitioner, Daniel Ingram, and that you also collaborated with and worked, and both of these are also kind of practitioners and teachers that have inspired me on my path. Daniel's book, The Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, was super pivotal. I mean, I think that's one of the most influential books that I think I've read, because to me, that was like what introduced me to Pragmatic Dharma. Before, it was like just reading Zen books, and I'm like, what the hell are they talking about? Everything is so cryptic. I don't know what I'm doing. And then when I read that book, it was like, whoa, like this is so transparent. He's talking about all of these realizations and all this stuff. And I think that was, he was actually the first guest on my podcast, Daniel Ingram. So yeah. And I think I also ended up coming across the Mind Illuminated through his book, because he mentions the Mind Illuminated there. And then as for Delson, I first heard about him on the Guru Viking podcast, and his story really blew me away. The fact that someone so young had like such realizations and was spending like incredible amounts of time practicing in Himalayan caves and having these profound experiences. It was really his story really felt unique to me. I guess I'd love to hear more about how you ended up linking with both Daniel and Delson, and maybe starting with Daniel. How did you end up doing the Fire Kasina retreat under his guidance, and what was the impact of that practice for you?
So Daniel, I met in Arizona when he spent a month with Culadasa. They were trying to see if they can play nice with one another. Like sparks were flying. It was a lot of fun. Every evening we would have a Dharma discussion and just seeing, both masters.
Dharma combat,
yeah. And I instantly connected with Daniel there. Like I saw him for the first time and went and gave him like a mountain of gratitude, which he very, very beautifully received. And we just started chatting every day about models and practice, and also a ton of other shit. We're just like shooting the shit about so much stuff. And so he ended up inviting me to Fire Kasina retreat, one of the first ones that I don't know if it was the first one. No, one of the first ones in Denman Island, just with a few select practitioners. And then, that's where our relationship just continued deepening. And suddenly he would just be this, I would call him, he doesn't want to really be a teacher, right? So
yeah.
Internet village elder.
Yeah.
And just email him with questions and insights. And the relationship just continued, and ultimately went to do a 23-day Fire Kasina retreat at his place in Alabama. And then he invited me to be a board member for the EPRC. And we've just become friends. He's a great dude to hang out with. A really amazing guy. Such a giant heart and like well wishes for the world. It's infectious in this manner to be next to him. Like he has this beautiful wide perspective of so many of the moving parts of our world, and where the leverage points are for doing impactful work. And it always inspires me when we spend time together. So that's how I met him. And then Delson.
Yeah, can I ask a couple more questions, because there's a couple of pieces there, and just to reflect, I also really much appreciate Daniel Ingram and his perspective. And I could also see like he's very technical. He has a very like technical mind, and I think you do too. And so I can see how there's overlap. I guess I'm a little curious more to hear about the Fire Kasina. And for those who don't know what that is basically meditating on like a light, and that could be like a flame candle. It could be just any kind of light, and just kind of really focusing on that. And I've heard Daniel share a little bit about that, and just kind of some of the profound experiences he's had. But I'm curious to know what the impact. I think it was like was it a 28-day retreat? I'm not sure. I don't remember how long the retreat. 23, you said? Yeah. So I'm curious what you found unique of that practice, and like just to hear more about that experience.
Yeah. So I guess to summarize the whole thing, I would say it's a beautiful way of collecting the mind, very different than the other ones, and it just slowly unfolds to become a psychedelic ride. And I use psychedelic both in the original sense of the term, psyche and delos, so mind manifesting or mind revealing, and in the sense of psychedelics in the more colloquial term, which is a bunch of crazy shit starts happening in front of your closed eyelids, growing in sophistication and fidelity and intricacy. And then all the way towards having some of the most profound, like incredible shows that were like happening in real time from a sober mind, that were sort of like a museum of consciousness, being able to see and get a direct and immediate feedback for what processes are happening inside of me, like tensions in the body and what they represent. All sorts of things buried in my psyche, playing out a sort of psychodrama in front of my eyes, and really with the immediate nuanced feedback about how the way that I subtly mentally relate to them affects the dance, affects what's happening in my psychology, in my psyche. So it was a very learning experience, and also a wonderful way of cleaning up the system, like all sorts of things that really needed this very wide space of the visual brain to unfurl into, right? Normally, the visual sense is the most intense one that we have. It's constantly bombarded, and so much of it, so much space in our brain is relegated to the visual. And so having it become available for this type of processing, for this type of practice, it's been invaluable. And then all the way towards what Daniel calls, that fourth screen is what he calls what I just described now. But then there's the type of experience that before having, I would be very skeptical of, coming from a very scientific background. But at some point I started having the types of experiences like are described in the suttas about visiting alternate realms of experience. And of course, I'm not making any metaphysical ontological claim here. I'm very pragmatic, and I like not getting caught up in explanations of reality, so to speak. But then the undeniable experience is a completely embodied, higher than real life resolution experience of a logically consistent alternative realm of existence, alternative realm of being, where sometimes I'm me, I can see just like my hands, sort of like a first person shooter. I'm sort of running around exploring a completely novel reality. And other times also seeing myself from a third person perspective and being all sorts of crazy animals or things, again, that are logically consistent and sort of move right and explore their surroundings. But between them and like the baseline earth reality that I know is very little. And those in particular, and this is also sort of how I do frame this in my mind sometimes, I like taking the psychodrama a step forward. It's like my mind spun its configuration in such a way that some assumptions or some things that had to be revealed in the space of this alternate reality got more emphasis and a way to be explored and touched on directly. And so deep insights into compassion and how all sorts of behaviors that I would have create suffering or are so easy to just put down and replace with love or something a little more loving and friendly. It's a very, very transformative experience in this regard. It's something that I highly recommend. Like if someone who's listening to this thinks they have the capacity to go on such a ride, I highly recommend it. There's also a way that it's like the pinnacle of emptiness in a sense, because every time the realm stops, the experience ceases. It sort of dissolves and become this reality again. And so you sort of start looking at this reality in the sense of, oh, I guess this is also all immediately mentally constructed by me in every moment, and everything that I'm doing is just based on whatever assumptions I'm carrying with me into it. So a very great, many beautiful insights. And yeah, I celebrate Daniel for having, in many ways, reinventing this practice, right? Because we only have sort of obscure manuals for 2,000 years ago. And he kind of revived it and played with it and experimented with it and started writing manuals and inviting people, and yeah, just like really playing with what's possible to do with the mind. And I will say to end, and we can explore this, so just leave it here, that after this retreat, I've done a few dark retreats, meaning being completely ensconced in perfect darkness for a few days, not having access to people, not having anything of my visual sense being stimulated from the outside. And that leads to many of the same spaces with all sorts of advantages that I won't go into now. There's a log that I have from the last one I did, which was 5 days, that I want to publish soon. And I'm so impressed by the transformative capacity of the darkroom practice that I've actually dabbled with the idea of like steering a lot of my teaching towards getting people to be able to go into a dark room and make the most out of the experience. That's really one that's not for newbies.
Yeah, I'm glad you you brought up the dark retreat, because when you were talking about the visuals, that was one of the things I was thinking about, because I've heard that you get really kind of profound visions in the dark. And that's, I've been really interested in the dark. I don't know if I'll ever get a chance to do one of those retreats, but that to me is so fascinating, because I can see how that can be so powerful, like just shutting off. I've done a lot of floating. I find floating to be very interesting. I don't know if you ever had a chance to do that, the sensory deprivation tank. But yeah, I can imagine this being like a whole nother level. So yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, there's a lot there we can.
I have a subscription to a place that's just like 5 minutes away from my house, and then go about once a month just to float for an hour and a half.
Nice. Yeah, that's what I did it actually weekly for a while, and more recently I started doing it once a week. But I really enjoy it. It's nice. It's a nice reset. Yeah. So I think there's a lot more that we could talk about with Fire Kasina and Dark Retreat, but I'm curious to hear a little bit about Delson and how he came into the picture for you.
And it's funny that you mentioned, because in the interim where we had our connectivity issues, I just looked at my phone and got a message from him. We have this ongoing conversation about the nature of being a sentient being versus an awake being, or like satta in the Pali Suttas versus bodhisatta, like awake mind, awake being. And Delson is someone who's gone very deep and all the way, very linearly, into complete emptiness, like complete merging with nibbana, as he would say, to the point where the type of constructs of mind coming up and making one a being, something that continues iterating on itself and being in the world, barely even arises. And so we were having this chat about this, and he says, I realized that not being a being is boring. Being a being is all of the interesting things. And I write that, and this is, I think, actually a very important aspect of this path, and a deep understanding that one can generate and have. It's that being a being, or like a sentient being in the sense of a construct that continually iterates and reinvigorates itself into existence, using the capacity for attention, using the capacity to pour energy and take what is on mind as the next moment of perception, right? And do it again and again and again. It is not in itself a bad thing. In some sense, the same 12 links that allow this sort of thing to happen are not an issue if what originates the intention to become a being is more so the ground, or nibbana, fundamental consciousness, versus if we have loops inside loops inside loops inside loops that forget what they are, that have what we call ignorance, like a lack of seeing, a vidya, of the ground. And so what Delson is telling me, and it gladdens my heart, is really the shift from the first turning of the wheel and into the later turnings, where they stopped just hiding in emptiness, so to speak, which is the main criticism of the Mahayana, of the Hinayana or the Theravada, and started thinking about what would it be like to craft a sentient being fed from the ground of being, fed from Nibbana, that is compassionate, that is loving, that is aligned with the ground, and then goes out to the world and participates in the world in that way. And it's not only skillful, again, in the context of what we talked about earlier, how to create the types of relationships and societies that we enjoy, that we want to take part in, but also in the sense of one's own path. Because every time you allow a being to exist, again, versus like hiding out in emptiness, is another opportunity for evolving the fundamental assumptions of mind. Every time you create a being, you also are privy to the types of flaws, right? I don't exactly like the word flaws, but any place, let's say, that you're not and could be in fuller alignment with the Dharma, fuller alignment with the flows of fundamental consciousness. And so I'm happy for the guy. He's creating the life that he wants, and from the highest perspective, from a perspective of one whose mind is free and can rest in Nibbana.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember like the first time I heard of Delson was on the Guru Viking podcast, and so much has happened since. He's had other podcasts where he's kind of went back on maybe some of his attainments, and some of the things that he kind of saw in a particular way, I guess, changed over time. And I remember this was a couple of years ago. I was watching a lot of his Dharma talks and I was reading his books. And then I came across this idea of the sutric versus tantric lens. And like it became very clear that he was like teaching from a sutric lens. And, and my understanding, like the sutric lens really, really emphasizes suffering. So it's interesting too. Like at that point, I feel like there was kind of like a lot of threads of depression. And I remember when I came across this idea of sutric and tantric, and I got this idea from this other practitioner, Charlie Aubrey, who I've had on a previous episode. And, and they basically said like there's a difference, like the sutric perspective works for a monastic, but it doesn't work for somebody who has a family, kids, and a job. And like that was just a huge insight for me, because I was like, wow, I was like, I can see how that wouldn't work. And it's kind of really interesting kind of seeing how Delson's journey played out, because it seems like maybe he's come around like, yeah, maybe I was in this sutric lens and, doing these long retreats, but I didn't really want to become a monk. I still wanted to kind of live life. And actually this, maybe the lens that you see from Vajrayana or from, the tantric lens is more applicable to being a being in the world rather than just sitting somewhere in a cave for the rest of my life,
Yeah. I do want to say, ultimately, well, the approach that I like sometimes could be called ekayana, like the one vehicle, right? The combination of the Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, Tantrayana. There is a way that sometimes I feel like a monk or a recluse. Sometimes if like last year with Delson, I went on this writing retreat, and in many ways I just minimized my life to just practice and writing, but also like in my day to day. Well, you saw me now, right? We had those issues, and I just like close my eyes and stay with myself for a bit. But every day I wake up and I try to stay on airplane with my smartphone for as long as possible.
Yeah.
So that my mind is free to be what it is before the rush of information from the world streams in. And I love the rush of information streaming in from the world. But there's a way to get the benefits from every aspect of those wisdoms. It's just that in my mind, the later vehicles make this beautiful move of transcending and including and even penetrating. And so I like walking them in exactly this way, right? That allows me to get the benefits from all of the paths, all of the wisdoms that I know, and tied together in this highest conception that I've run across, which is very much exemplified by Tibetan Buddhism. And the way that I found out about Delson was through a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, or I guess he would not identify as such. It's John Churchill, who I'm quite sure you're familiar with.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Whose conception of the greater path is one that I perhaps most admire. Highly recommend the interviews with him. And if you haven't had one, I would love to see him, have a chat with you.
He's coming. It's interesting because I just had a conversation with a different practitioner, Daniel Thorson. Actually, this podcast is, as we're having this conversation, that podcast is being released. But he's in his course in John Churchill's training, and he was raving about it, that from his perspective, that's kind of the most comprehensive view of Dharma. But yeah, please continue. Yeah.
I really I really feel called to say even more. I really like John's conception of the path, and he also has a lot of the heart emphasis, and he speaks to it and guides towards it very beautifully. And at the time, I had a few calls with him. I was looking for some direction for my own path, and he gave me like a few pointers, a few options. And one of them, because he knew that I came myself from a deep Theravadan background, was pointing towards TWIM as something that, coming from a sort of very Theravadan flavored jhana practice, ultimately culminates in something that's almost like the Essence Mahamudra or Dzogchen view. And so I picked it up, and then I caught Delson on the Guru Viking, and I like that day, I started reading the book, saw the video, and then like went online to see if there's a retreat. I managed to sign up as the last available spot. Everything was like this, and I find myself in a retreat with them very quickly and connected very well. Spent hours and hours talking. Just was very drawn to the guy.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's really interesting that John Churchill recommended TWIM for you as like as something to investigate. And the other thing, I really appreciate the nuance you brought in, because I think the way I was framing the sutric and tantric kind of lens has this like very like dualistic right or wrong, but there is this is something that I've been learning too, is this having kind of a metasystemic lens, the fact that we could change lenses and views and vehicles, and like you can actually use the sutric view or like renunciation in a very skillful way. And it doesn't mean that it's like you're embedded in that. It's like you can use different lenses as they're appropriate, as depending on what's arising in your experience.
Yeah. I'll say on this, the exploration that I'm most passionate about recently, that's really like thickening my knowledge of the growing up stuff, is with Stages International. I think I know you're also familiar with them.
I just got like the intro course, but I'm also studying that model. So I'm curious to hear what's been landing with you with that. Yeah.
And I have the privilege of having Kim Barta, who's the co-founder, co-creator of this, take me as a mentee, which has been really beautiful. And so I like seeing the Sutra versus Vajra paths as one that are suitable for people at different perspective or different stages of growing up. The Sutra, has its lists, and it's a little more rule-based and do's and don'ts, even as they call them precepts. And I really appreciate that they're precepts and not like, laws from God. It's still like, do this, don't do that, and practice like this. And when you do this, then go towards that, and maybe you'll suit this. And then this is what enlightenment is, and this is what the attainments are, and this is how you'll know. It's very, very rigid in some sense. And then Vajrayana has much more to do with the much more subtle feeling, tuning into yourself and trusting the wisdom that you've created in your practice, and also the wisdom stemming from the ground that you come in more and more into contact with, to be the ultimate guide. And the thing is, it's not that one perspective is better than the other. It is true that they're a linear progression, meaning one will only come after the other, right? But the healthiest thing is to fill them all out. The biggest master will be both a sutra master and a vajra master. As you, especially as you just start your path in Vajrayana, and generally speaking, in the let's call it the 4.0 perspective in stages speak, you will not have a robust enough understanding of your internal subtle life to make all the decisions. So sometimes you will have to lean back on what you know before, and it's always good to have a full enough stage before going into the next one, so that you have like the healthy perspective at all ranges, everywhere you participate in the world, and really play the card that's available to you. That's the highest that's available to you, while also knowing that you have the others in the deck. So in the same way, even as sometimes we like to pretend that the later turnings are better, and sometimes if I say transcending and including, it's some people would be like, oh, that's just like a smug way of saying better.
Yeah.
Well, sure, it's better in some way, but it's not better in every way. And so I would not just put down the sutra, or in the same way that I would not just put down the emptiness. Or I really like the way that everything comes together, and the spiral motion through everything into sustainable and healthy growth.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the developmental lens, and like filling out all these different ways of seeing, and these different views and these different paths. In reading your book also, I noticed streams of wisdom that seem to trace back to Dan Brown, who I believe was one of your teachers at some point. I think the term basis of operation, which you reference often, originally came from him. Curious to know like the role that Dan played in your development as a teacher and practitioner. What do you feel he uniquely contributed to your understanding to the path of awakening, especially in ways that were distinct from maybe other teachers or lineages you worked with? And I guess I'm really curious about this too, because I've got to briefly work with Dan towards the end of his life. And actually my current teacher is Dustin DiPerna. That's, and like we know each other too through Riggs, and maybe you've got a chance to kind of work with Dustin as well. So kind of, I'm interested about that stream as well.
So Dan is someone that I hold in the highest regard. I see him as a true hero of humanity. Like the disciplined and dedicated way that he brought the teachings, the most core teachings and pith instructions from what he considered to be most advanced Tibetan lineages and multiple Tibetan lineages, and got their permission to teach in the West, and got their blessing to infuse that with Western teachings, him being Harvard-trained psychologist of many decades, and then infusing into the path his deep knowledge of attachment theory, attachment styles, and then how to develop our attachment systems in a way that in itself was a contribution to the path. And I really like the way that in some sense John Churchill is continuing this work and talking about how we essentially develop what he calls a healthy attachment to the Great Mother, right? To Ma. I would say to fundamental consciousness. So sometimes I like saying in the relational context that now more and more I'm securely attached to the divine in a way that really is, I truly believe these days is the only way to be truly safely attached to a human partner, is when you have a full secure attachment to yourself. It's when all of your parts know that they can rely on one another and it's not a constant battleground. And then there's this trust that develops in reality, in life, in something greater than just my own capacity to take care of myself. And that for me, in my own practice, in my own dharmic practice and relational path, has been what has allowed me to come into more and more of a secure attachment, regardless of what is happening with my partner. So I consider his contributions to be like really beautiful in this regard. And the language that he's created, the whole path, this is how I know of the 3 maps and the 4 yogas of each map. And as later also elaborated on by Dustin, I think that Dustin is doing the most beautiful work right now in the dharmic world. I have so much appreciation for him. I've learned so much from Dustin. And yeah, so this lineage between Dan and Dustin is one that just it moved me so deeply. Just reflecting on this, on the beautiful work that they've done, on their dedication. It's so inspiring. Both of them as figures, as teachers, as dharmic exemplars.
Yeah, no, it brings a lot of joy to my heart to kind of hear you reflecting on that, and feel a lot of gratitude that I've blessed to be like standing in that stream, like kind of soaking that in. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This last interview that I did with Daniel Thorson, we were talking about John Churchill, and he's, Daniel's also got really into like attachment work and this notion of secure attachment to reality that Churchill speaks about. So it's interesting how it's like coming up now. I'm like, whoa, I'm paying attention to the signs. I'm like, all right, I think my next conversation needs to be with John Churchill, because it's just like bubbling up. Like I don't even know if you were familiar with him. Like, I had these kind of the idea of talking about Delson and Daniel and Dan, and then John comes up as well. So it's just interesting how like all these threads are coming together. Something I wanted to talk about also is, you're also an investor in technologies that help facilitate the process of awakening. And I'm wondering if you could share a bit more in what technologies you have invested so far, as well as what you see some of the promise and maybe also limitations of what technology can contribute to the awakening process.
Yeah. So first of all, there's a lot of information about the companies that I'm most excited about on my webpage. There's both a link from a homepage at megananda.org, and also you can just go to theawakeningfund.com. I wanted to be very clear that the thing that I'm interested in investing in are technologies that contribute to the path of awakening, and not that, I'm in Silicon Valley and there's a lot of technologies that contribute to cognitive enhancement. Falling asleep and just like sort of finessing our lives. When I'm particularly cynical, I like saying that I'm not so much interested in technologies that make us better cogs in the machine, but rather ones that allow us to wake up from our inception with an inception with an inception, and then allow us to craft better machines that are more beneficial to our well-being. So it's not just about making for a smoother ride, right, in the in the current machine, but really creating something that celebrates more of our humanity, more of the wholeness of how we are. So having said that, the technologies that I'm most excited about are ones that can, in ever-increasing sophistication, target particular structures of the brain, whether it's by depositing energy in very precise locations, or by tweaking even very subtle and precise amino acids that then intervene with the capacity of certain cells to express certain membrane receptors, and then tune down very subtly, for example, the response to serotonin in a particular that changes a particular aspect of the limbic system, such that you're a little less anxious, and then more prime for the type of fundamental restructuring of mind that meditation leads you to. So there are all sorts of ways with those subtle tweaks. And then, of course, with imaging and giving immediate feedback to the person, whether on meditation or throughout the day, that I'm hoping, again, will denecessitate meditation altogether. So that meditation becomes something that you do for fun, right? It's just like you wanna hang out and just like rest the nervous system in this way, versus you need to do it because otherwise you go crazy, or you need to do it because your monkey mind is just not getting you any rest, or you have a lot of shame that you want to handle and you don't know how to. I think if we have, and we're very close to being able to do that, something that continually sits very subtly, like an electrode here, or something that mounts in or inside an earbud and can subtly tune your brain in a very beneficial, very dharmic way. Of course, those technologies can be very dangerous. And throughout the day, reports to you on what you like, can inform you about what moves to take, can enhance those moves with like a little tickle to some area of the brain. And also, even beyond that, direct you how to relate to another person based on what your app knows what the other person is going through, because they're also being tracked and tuned this way. Then even allows for relationships that not only can be smoother, more loving, more joyful for the participants, but also themselves can become a dharmic exploration or a way to deepen in the practice. And then ultimately, just by leveraging those spaces that we have throughout the day, where we're not, full on doing something, right? And it can be like a tiny tweak to your posture, or it can be like informing you that you're holding something and have some anxiety. So take a breath and feel the feelings. Or you can have a time where something is just going so crazy inside of your mind, and we know that there's a subtle way to tune it so that it doesn't just like pave over what's happening. It just gives you a little extra capacity to be with what is. And I'm hoping if enough people use a sophisticated enough suite of tools, sophisticated enough technology, maybe we can decrease the time that we spend on the cushion, just doing dedicated practice, to a minimum, and eventually not have to do it anymore at all. And certainly, I think this is possible if we not only use the technology, or what we call technology, electrons and ultrasound and whatever, but also the technology of crafting more sophisticated societies in terms of their ability to allow us to come into non-zero sum interactions between us.
Yeah, no, really appreciate you unpacking that. I think there's a lot of interesting aspects. I think one of the things you were saying about, like, especially about relationships, like being able to see, like, say I'm interacting with my wife and there's something I'm not noticing, or I'm being rigid in a particular way, and it could kind of illuminate that. I think that's really interesting. I do think there is, like, what I've heard, kind of the pushback against maybe some meditation tech is that, I guess really it seems like a big portion of what they're trying to do with meditation tech is like eliminate suffering. So the argument is that if we prematurely eliminate suffering, we strip people from the ability to develop ethics, and this notion that there's something that's being learned through suffering. So I'm curious what you think about that argument.
Mm-hmm. There is a very careful balancing act that we will have to do as we grow in power in terms of what these technologies are capable of. Because the worst thing that we want to do is create soma, right? Like the Brave New World type of soma, something that just pacifies you and even makes you like, again, a better cog in the machine, like just an easy to herd sheep. And if we eliminate suffering through taking away signal, then we will have lost the plot. If we rather allow technology to enhance your capacity to take signal and integrate it in skillful ways, then we will have done a great service to all sentient beings on this planet. And it's not gonna be easy. It is my hope that the people who create these technologies, and that's also a parameter that I'm taking into account when I decide whether to invest in a company or not, are ones that can be skillful stewards of these devices, of these technologies. And we have this humanity-wide discussion about AI, about this new almost life form that we're creating. And in my mind, the consciousness that's creating it right now, the collaborative consciousness, is in some sense a womb for this new being being gestated. And the assumptions that are baked into it, just like a mother with a young child, are the ones that they're going to operate from, and then have a giant impact on all of our lives based on. And so in similar fashion, like I really want the people who create these technologies to be informed to the highest degree by what would be, let's call it Dharma aligned. And in many ways, the book that I'm writing are meant for people like that, who are, let's say, more technical or not mystical oriented, just like me. I don't care for the mystical claims. I care for founded and as much as possible empirically measured frameworks and results. That's how I think, you know, it's such a benefit of a way of thinking in the West that we can infuse into the Dharma. And then I want to then use that capacity to infuse the Dharma into the lives of anyone who not necessarily even meditating, just to create the type of meme space that's more and more in line with our dharmic insights, and have those inform the technologies that we create from these like awakening technologies, from things zapping your brain and telling you how you might want to be, and to the new life form that we're creating in the form of AI.
I mean, this notion of what view is AI being created from, and like who are the leaders in AI and where are they functioning from? Like, I know, for example, like I've heard Sam Altman talk about, like, he's like gone deep into meditation and he's big on meditation. But then there's also this idea that there's different ways of looking at Dharma and meditation. And, the other practitioner that I recently just had, Daniel Thorson, he had an article called The Upper Middle Path and Tech Bro Buddhism. And, he kind of talks about how there is this conception of Dharma where it's like, I just want to get rid of suffering and just optimize, right? I'm going to get into these jhana states. I'm going to optimize. I'm going to get rid of my suffering. I'm going to be more productive. And I'm kind of just going to feed into the systems that are there, right? And it's like not questioning the systems that are maybe dysfunctional and maybe are, some would say that maybe leading to collapse or like existential risk and things like that. So it is interesting how people have different conceptions of Dharma, and there is a way to kind of use meditation to bypass. So it's like, it is important that the founders and the people that are working with these technologies are kind of functioning from a place of wisdom. And there's many different ways of like using meditation. So those are some of the thoughts that kind of come up, and some of the like concern that maybe some of the founders and the people that are building these technologies, like they may even have a lot of meditation experience, but there still might be something like they're not seeing, kind of that it's still kind of working in the same system or working in systems that don't have the best effects on society at large.
Yeah. So, one thing I want to say is that the last thing I would ever want to do is shame anyone if they have a practice that I think is less complete or, a lesser understanding. Just the fact that they're open to meditating, that they're open to some of the Dharma is beautiful. And I wouldn't want to imply that they need to do something different. Like the worst thing someone can do for themselves is be like, oh, I heard I should have different passions and practice a different way than what I think is best for me from my best understanding. And if we, of course I did not hear it in your voice, but some people, when they say tech bro, there's like a mocking energy. It's like, to put it down. And I want to say, like, a view that I recommend everyone at least is able to entertain is that we're all doing our best. From our perspectives, from the information available to us, from the conditions of our lives, from the karma that we're carrying, we're all doing our best. And when we truly understand this in every fiber of our being, that's also where compassion comes from. Because if something comes out of you that is other than compassion, and to be clear, forcefulness can also come out of compassion, right? It's not being nice. It's being compassionate. Anything other than compassion coming out has an assumption that the other person or the reality as a whole could or should have been different. And so in this sense, the enlightened move is always one that's more of a yes and, that appreciates and acknowledges where the person is and tries to give a gift or tries to invite into something that might be appealing to them and you both consider to be better. Now, having said that, I also want to say, I think at least the OpenAI, but I'm sure also the other main AI teams are in really good hands. I personally have worked for some time with one of the OpenAI founders, and I know the person who used to be my mentor, who's working very closely with the core research and capacity OpenAI team. It's Joe Hudson. And I could not envision a better shepherd for this process for them. I know the people there understand the weight of responsibility that they have. And even if from outside, sometimes it's easy to be cynical and be like, oh, they just want to make money. Oh, they just want power. I'd recommend people see the places in themselves that are like that are seeking power, that are seeking status and money and owning the projection, right? As a way of seeing more clearly, as a way of respecting that those people are people just like themselves. And also have the knowledge that those people, just like us, just like the listeners of your podcast, I'm sure, are looking to do good, are really using the best perspective that they have to see how to take care of themselves, how to take care of their needs, but also to create a better world for all of us. I really have a lot of confidence about this, especially for AI developers around me in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up Joe Hudson, and I'm really interested. I really appreciate his work that he does around coaching, and I know I've seen he had a conversation with Sam Altman, so that's actually cool that he's engaged with that team and he's working with them. And it's also, it seems like you have a predominantly positive view of where AI is moving and the people that are working on it, which is interesting, because I think a lot of the people I've been in conversation, they have more of a kind of concerned, maybe more of a negative, pessimistic view. So it's really interesting for me
to have my concern.
Yeah, I guess but it seems in general that you're more optimistic about it. So it's really interesting for me to talk to people that kind of have opposing views, especially on something like AI, and just kind of hear different streams. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. It is my opinion. I don't have many opinions, but one opinion that I have is that for the most part, from the same reason that evolution has made us much more susceptible and sensitive to conceiving of negative outcomes and trying to avoid them, right? Our minds are much more slanted towards how to avoid the negative than to cultivate the positive. We're much more likely to have a doomeristic attitude towards things. And I'm saying this not to in any way downplay the concerns around AI. I closely follow the developments and I'm in the conversations. It's inescapable where I live. It's all around me. And I have the concerns, but it's also that I truly believe that if we adopt a more positive outlook that's based in gratitude for what we have versus a more vague sense of what can go wrong, it will inform the way that we are creating AI and any other technology in a way that benefits the creation and has a higher chance of leading us towards desirable outcomes. There's a way that when we're stuck in a sense of everything is kind of bad and can explode and go wrong in any given moment, that's what we project into the world and that's what we invite and create. And it's one of the hardest tasks as a human to be able to identify that thought construct, that vicious cycle, and step out of it and sort of replace the operating system with something that's more based in gratitude, in love, in well wishes, in a type of continued intention for how to bring the highest and most positive intention for the world, for our relationships, for what we create in the world, not by pushing away the concerns, actually in a way that highlights the concerns that stay there even as we take a positive attitude, so that we are much more sane in terms of identifying what truly matters, what truly needs to be avoided.
Yeah. I think the aspect that you're talking about is like not pushing away certain things that need to be addressed. And I think some of, the people that I hear pushing back against like the techno-optimist view, as that there is some kind of a bypassing for some of those people that hold that view. It's like not looking at what could go wrong and just like, oh, everything's progressing, everything's moving in the right direction, where there are potential, paths where we veer off in very catastrophic ways.
Yep. Yeah, the technology is going to save everything thing is, I like also putting it into the category of spiritual bypassing.
Yeah.
But at least if you have the view that technology will save everything, I hope you also consider yourself to be technology, and then want to upgrade yourself in exactly the same ways that I propose and that we've been talking about in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's another thread that I wanted to bring in, and I think it's really kind of important to hold this with, like you said, compassion, and kind of knowing that people are trying to do their best at any given moment, but sometimes things kind of veer off. And, this is something I've been thinking about a lot, is the complex relationship we have with spiritual teachers. And many on the path of awakening look to these figures for guidance, inspiration, and as living examples of what's possible. But time and again, we see controversies arise, sometimes minor, sometimes deeply troubling, that can, leave people feeling disappointed, disillusioned, even traumatized. And, it raises a difficult but important question. And that's like, how do we navigate the need for spiritual exemplars while also acknowledging the reality of human fallibility and imperfection? And, I know you worked and studied closely with Culadasa, and sadly, like many spiritual teachers before him, he became the subject of controversy and scandal toward the end of his life. And I imagine much of this unfolded while you were like still closely involved with him. And like, I'm curious, how did that experience affect you and your relationship with him, if at all? And how did you kind of process everything that was coming up during that time?
Mm-hmm. Well, first and foremost, in the context of technology, I will say what was apparent to me in those moments was that Culadasa was simply lacking some of the human technology that now in the year 2025, or even then 2020, whenever it was, we take for granted. The way that he grew up, he just did not have access to, let's say, a type of capacity for emotional expression and for relational dynamics that now we're taught even in kindergarten. And so they sort of seem almost impossible not to have, like for in much the same way as how we judge older cultures for things that now seem like so obvious, like how could they, right? And so there's some of that there. And also there's of course a way that it's informed my own explorations into going all the way towards the types of human technologies or psychotechnologies that I, in my view, would prevent the type of needless explosion that happened with some of the people close to him from happening. It has to do with clearer and conscious communication, has to do with how to deal with triggers, reflecting suppressed emotions and all sorts of limiting beliefs, how to treat your partners, how to treat your loved ones from a perspective of vulnerability, empathy, and being with them as a form of their expanded consciousness versus something that's polarized from them and has some friction that entails a loss of the, let's say, the bandwidth allowing truth and love to come through cleanly and openly and completely, right? Like this twisting of the connection lines, and that's a lot more on the growing up and cleaning up and some, I don't even care to name some of those buckets. It's how to be healthy and mature relational human, and there are technologies that he just did not possess. And so even as I think, from my limited perspective, that he operated from his highest, or he did his best, that best was not enough to avert the explosion, to create a circumstance where all of the participants in his life and the people closest to him were satisfied with how he showed up in the world. And that's unfortunate. And we learn from these types of explosions, and then we improve our teachings and improve our standards and improve our processes for both how to avoid unnecessary pain and then also how to mend it when it happens. So that's my take on it. Personally, with him, I think I've become world class at continuing to love people and being their friends, even as they're going through shit and other people have qualms with them and make them into bullies and themselves victims, or perpetrators and victims. And so I loved him the best that I knew how to, all the way towards his final days. And I'm glad that I did. I'm glad that I could be there for him in this way, just like unconditionally loving him. Of course, not in a way that enables behavior that I thought was where I thought he could do better, like with the right pointer, with the right information, with the right urging. But but being there for him as a friend and being in a loving, friendly relationship with him, even as his world was coming down on him, people seeing him in a different light and his health continually deteriorating, and seeing him lose his capacity to finish all of the work that he so much wanted to give to the world.
I appreciate that you're kind of had that capacity to hold all that, at that point, I guess having that space and the insight that you had to be able to kind of hold that and kind of have that nuance. I think one of the things you said is that we can see somebody as a villain when people do things wrong. I had a different person on this podcast, and a different practitioner, and they brought up, like MLK doing something wrong or Gandhi doing something wrong, and that people can make mistakes, and then those mistakes end up kind of overriding all the good that they've done, or everything that's good. So like being able to kind of have that nuance and be like, yeah, this person actually contributed in a lot of positive ways in this way, and they were really skilled in this way, but they had some blind spots and they made mistakes here. And like you said, they didn't have the technology. And I mean, if people understood Culadasa's story, I mean, he had a lot of trauma, from my understanding, in childhood, very difficult childhood. And I know later on, he worked with another practitioner, Douglas Tatterin, who I've had on this podcast, and they did a lot of emotional work. And here you have kind of Culadasa, who's like this meditation master, who's went very deep with emptiness, but then there's all these layers of emotional stuff. And actually listened to interview with Matthew Immigrant, which is a co-author on the Mind Illuminated. And, he kind of also was speaking about what happened with Culadasa, and and this, we spoke about this earlier, about this notion of sitting with parts and allowing parts to arise and kind of dissipate, and then actually engaging with parts and doing the relational work there, which those are kind of two different threads. So yeah, it's just interesting how somebody can go so far into emptiness and awakening and have genuine realizations. And then at the same time, there's all these other aspects of development that are kind of endless, and there's so many ways humans can develop relationally, emotionally, in the world in terms of being effective. So there's a lot of food for thought there.
It makes me want to in a way of continuing the thread of development, say that the capacity to see a particular person, to see a human, and let's to put it very bluntly, appreciate the good and discard the bad, right? Like to take the gifts that they've given and not just throw out the baby with the bathwater because they did something bad. That's a quality of a higher developmental perspective. Being able to go beyond just, is he more good or more bad? And if it's more bad, then we push him away. If it's more good, then we put him on a pedestal. It's just like, he's a human. He's a complex entity. And the other thing that's important for me to say is, Culadasa still, I would not say, is someone who only went on a path of emptiness. And definitely, from my experience with him, especially at the time, was that he was the most open-hearted person by far out of anyone that I've met. Sitting with him, it just, there was the intellectual stimulation and the drinking from the wisdom fire hose, but also just a sense of sitting across from a Care Bear who's continually shooting a beautiful ray of kindness and love towards you. It's always on. And that's something that I want to celebrate. And maybe not many people know, seeing him as like this incredibly intellectually gifted and wise teacher, but also so much heart. So much heart.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that you had such a positive experience with him. And I guess the one piece I do want to include is this notion of kind of boundaries, right? Because sometimes like we can have this black or white, like good or bad, but you could appreciate somebody, you could appreciate a lot about somebody and still also know that in a particular interaction or a particular context or relationship, there might need to be a boundary. So I think sometimes just, the lens of love everybody, right? Like the way that lens can be used for somebody that doesn't have good boundaries is that they get taken advantage of. So I think there is some kind of nuance that I just want to kind of double click on with the boundaries aspect. Yeah. I'm also saying this, not like I'm pretty sure you understand this completely, but I just want to make sure that people who are listening get that piece as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for adding that in.
Yeah. I mean, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I know we had some challenges with timing and we had some internet connection stuff. So things were kind of messy, but I really, really appreciated this dialogue. We really touched on so many things from your book, The Heart Illuminated, and, the inspiration of Culadasa and working with him, working with Daniel Ingram and Delson Armstrong and, Dan Brown and how that streams influenced you.
Yeah.
And, we touched on meditation tech and AI and how that, that might be beneficial and how we could use that to maybe accelerate awakening and potentially get people to a place where they won't even need to meditate. Just really kind of, touching into fundamental consciousness and awakened awareness more easily. So I really appreciate all these threads and I'm really grateful that we got to have this chat. Is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap up here today, Dor?
This was great. Really lovely conversation. I feel very complete and spent and well used. So I'm appreciating you.
Yeah. All right, Dor. Thanks a lot. Appreciate you.
Thank you.